human-like conditions. Preliminary analysis of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights indicates that Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, Eritrean Armed Forces, and Amhara's regional forces and affiliated militia have all committed serious violations of international law, possibly amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Despite nearly 8 months of conflict and atrocities, thus far, the international community has failed to take robust action to address the situation in Tigray. Today, we are here to discuss how the UN Human Rights Council can act on this crisis during its ongoing 47th session. We are joined today by Ms. Tsedale Lemma, founder and editor-in-chief of Addis Standard, Ms. Laetitia, the Horn of Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, and Mr. Fisseha Tekle, Horn of Africa researcher at Amnesty International. A few housekeeping details before we begin. This event is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. We are hoping to wrap up the discussion 40 minutes past the hour and open the floor to member states. Delegations wishing to speak should indicate their intentions in the chat function. Please keep your remarks to 2 minutes each. And while the event is ongoing, the elements of the discussion will be live tweeted via the Global Center Twitter account at GCRTP. So thank you all for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll welcome the esteemed panelists here. And my first question will be to Ms. Lemma. Tsedale, you have been a journalist focused on Ethiopian affairs for many years. Given your extensive knowledge and coverage of the political landscape in the country, can you tell us how did we get here?
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for having me. This is a very difficult question to try to answer in 2 minutes, but I will try my best. The way we reached at this point traces back its origin to the kind of authoritarian political system that we have had since the last attempt to reconstitute the Ethiopian state in 1995. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, he came on the back of a collapsing system. And one of the things that he promised was to reform that system and to be able to conduct a democratic election. With that, of course, came the liberalization of the political space, which has been massively mismanaged in most parts for the last 3 years. And with that, the second dynamic to that is, which came along with liberalization of the political space that was not managed properly, was also the collapse of the previous system, which has led to some kind of animosity between the former party members, including the Prime Minister's newly formed party and the TPLF-led government in Tigray regional state, which has refused to join the party that the Prime Minister wanted to establish fresh. So these two major dynamics have led to that political violence that the country is reeling from since Prime Minister Abiy came to power. The first is a failed attempt at liberalizing the political space. The second is in the attempt to dismantle an authoritarian system that held the country through an iron fist for 27 years prior to that. Both of them needed to have a political consensus among all major players and not animosity and clashes, but the clashes is what took over. And that has led us today to become a country that is experiencing civil war, a full-fledged civil war, and several armed conflicts throughout the country, in most parts of the country.
So I unmute. No, thank you so much for that, Tsedale. That's really insightful and gives us a place to begin this discussion and go more in depth in understanding what is actually happening in Tigray today and in Ethiopia at large today. So my next question is to Fisseha and Laetitia. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have both been at the forefront of providing legal analysis of violations of international law in Tigray. including on the massacre in Aksum, the indiscriminate shelling of civilian populated areas across Tigray, and attacks on schools and Tigray's healthcare facilities. What is your analysis of the situation for civilians in Tigray? Do these violations and abuses rise to the level of crimes against humanity and war crimes? We can start with you, Laetitia, and then go on to Fisseha.
Okay, I thought we were going to go the other way around, but very happy to do it this way around as well. Well, thank you very much for hosting this event today. I mean, maybe just to start, because I think this point is very important for our discussion today, we are once again facing a communication shutdown in Tigray. So this is a context which, especially in the first months, but repeatedly throughout the context, because of actions by the warring parties and notably the federal government in terms of restrictions on communications, this is a conflict which is very difficult to document in real time. And so it is very hard to basically ensure that the impact on civilian today is known on the international level. And I think this is where ensuring that there are forums where there are official discussions and where information will be discussed amongst stakeholders is so key and needs to be formalized. On the other hand, our organization, amongst others, now have documented ample evidence of atrocities having been committed since the beginning of the conflict. I mean, here we're talking about, as the High Commissioner herself has underlined, both serious human rights violation, but also violations of humanitarian law, including war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. Civilians have been killed, massacred, and Fisseha will speak to some of the findings in Aksum, particularly boys and men, but also women have faced widespread sexual violence. And I think this issue is key to a point I will touch on later, which is the fact that what we are talking about in terms of the humanitarian crisis is also a human rights crisis and is also directly the result of warring parties' attacks on civilians and on civilian infrastructure throughout the conflict. So we've documented how government forces, Eritrean forces, and Amhara regional forces have attacked, destroyed, and also pillaged key civilian infrastructure. So in the first weeks of the conflict, we documented how in the offensive, that government forces indiscriminately shelled at least 3 towns. So this killed civilians, it led to significant injury of civilians, and basically resulted in what was the beginning of what has been a massive internal displacement, but also displacement into neighboring Sudan. So in the initial 6 weeks of the conflict, many of the people who were fleeing from Western Tigray and fled into neighboring Sudan, where there are currently 62,000 refugees. We've documented attacks on civilian infrastructure. So on schools, for example. Now, occupation of schools is not a war crime in itself. And we have actually documented occupation of schools by all the warring parties, including the Tigrayan forces, notably in one of the 2 refugee camps, which hosted thousands of Eritrean refugees that have now been destroyed. Another unheard of event in this conflict has been the destruction of 2 refugee camps by warring parties. In terms of the destruction of the schools, occupation, but we've also seen destruction of equipment in schools and also pillaging of schools, which are war crimes. In terms of attacks on civilian infrastructure, we've also documented attacks on medical facilities, notably in late November in the town of Aksum by Eritrean and Ethiopian federal government forces. And as the international NGO Médecins Sans Frontières have said, have characterized these attacks as deliberate attacks on the health facility in the region. As you can imagine, this not only has an impact in the immediate future, but also in the medium and longer term future of the region. Coming to this issue of warring parties' actions and the direct impact on the humanitarian crisis. So the attacks on civilians is obviously having an impact on their ability to access humanitarian assistance. When individuals have been targeted, boys and men targeted for killings, notably after severe bouts of fighting, and when girls have risked serious sexual violence, this is most likely contributing to the lack of access of many humanitarian access actors to much of the population. In terms of humanitarian access, we are also talking about bureaucratic restrictions, especially in the initial phases of the conflict. We're talking about ongoing restrictions at checkpoints, all of which is contributing to difficulties for the humanitarian community to access a population in need of assistance now. So this again points to the need to the international community to be monitoring what is actually happening on the ground, what humanitarian access is really available and humanitarian, and where the distributions are actually reaching, and who of the population in need is receiving the assistance. I'll leave it here for now.
Thank you for that, Fisseha.
Thank you, Savita, and also thank you, Laetitia, about depicting the humanitarian and the security situation in Tigray. Yes, we have documented also a number of attacks on civilians. Targeted attack on civilians. The most reported one is Aksum violence that happened on 28th and 29th of November. And as Laetitia has said, the blackout of information has challenged our capacity to report it in real time, because we published our report in February, and others have also followed. But you can see that how the communication blackout is affecting the work of human rights organizations to report this level of atrocity after 3 or 4 months. And our finding in Aksum shows that the Eritrean forces in Aksum town were under fire from a small group of armed and unarmed militia, and also the youth who joined the fighting in the morning of 28th. And after repelling the attack, the Eritrean forces went house to house, killing people, in some cases killing multiple members of a household, father and sons. So in addition to those killings that has at least claimed 200 lives, they didn't allow the people, their families, to collect and bury them on time. So the burial took place after 2 days on 30th of November, an important day in Aksum, which is an annual religious festival in the historical town of Aksum. But what we saw in Aksum is just the tip of the iceberg. We have seen similar killings targeting civilians in other places in Tigray. I can mention some of them, like the killing in Tekle River on the bridge. Tekle is a river Tekle. On the bridge, at least 50 people were killed on January 17 after being collected from Addis town, which is a nearby town in western part of Tigray. In Dagaberhe, which is like 32 kilometers from Aksum, the Ethiopian Defense Forces killed dozens of people on 5th of February. In Bora, a small city in the southern part of Tigray, the Ethiopian forces killed similarly dozens of people on 8th of January. all of them are reprisal attacks for attacks by the TDF. And the most recent one, the airstrike in Dagasulus town, which is close to Mekelle last week on 22nd of June, is the most recent one. According to information from health workers, at least 64 people were killed due to that airstrike on a marketplace. In addition to the airstrike on a civilian marketplace, the wounded were able to be taken to Mekelle city after 2 days because the government forces and the checkpoints were not allowing ambulances and health workers to go and pick the wounded and the injured. In addition to all these killings targeting civilians, we have documented a widespread act of gender-based violence in the conflict, starting from November up to June, until the time we have been documenting this. A number of people, hundreds of people, were victims of gender-based violence, specifically rape, and some of them by group of soldiers, Eritrean soldiers, Ethiopian National Defense Forces, and Amhara forces. And women and girls were not safe in IDPs, as some of the victims have told us they were raped while they were in IDP camps, especially in Shire. These are some of the situations in Tigray. The conflict is still raging, and we are really worried that what is happening right now while communication is still severely restricted, except in Mekelle. Thank you.
No, thank you both for that. I mean, and both of you have emphasized the fact that there's an information blackout. Humanitarian aid itself is highly politicized. Access is really problematic. So, I mean, that also should send a message to member states, and especially at the UN Security Council, where there's so much attention on this whole aspect of humanitarian aid, that it's not only just the humanitarian aid, but access is also something which is very contentious, and which in itself has become a human rights violation, as Laetitia very eloquently pointed out. So my next question is to Tsedale. And Tsedale, you stated in your recent New York Times piece that there is no end in sight to the conflict. What do you believe is prolonging this conflict and the suffering of civilian populations?
Thank you again. It's a good question. I like to divide it into two. One is pre and post the conflict. The reason why there is no end in sight of this conflict, if I can say from the before the conflict, the events that were happening before the conflict, there were multiple calls from the international community when the situation were deteriorating, particularly after Tigray unilaterally held its regional election, or the election for its regional councils in September. The relationship between the two, the center, the federal government, and the Tigray regional state government, was only deteriorating. The two were exchanging a lot of, very dangerous rhetorics. After that election, they went into a mutual delegitimization process, and the international community has been calling for calm, for a political, process to begin, so the two can settle the differences, because essentially this is a political difference that went into a military violence. And so there was no answer there was no readiness from both sides to settle the political difference through dialogue. In fact, there was a couple of messages from the Tigray regional state putting some demands about the dialogue to be all-inclusive and not only the Tigray government and the federal government, and the federal government did not accept that. So all the calls that were forwarded by the international community for de-escalation and dialogue. These were the two words prior to the war that the international community was forwarding to both authorities to settle their differences on. And on the 1st of November, it included the Eritrean president who issued an almost declaration of war statement. This was 3 days before the war broke out. And on the 2nd of November, for example, the EU had called out for calm because there was a massive mobilization of troops from Eritrea and from the Ethiopian government towards the Tigray government. And so all these calls for de-escalation and dialogue went unanswered. And they went into the military conflict on the 4th of November. After that, the calls continued for 8 months now for dialogue, consensus. This can only be solved through a political dialogue, through a negotiation. None of them were answered. In fact, nowadays, the Ethiopian government, because the Ethiopian government has been automatically rejecting any calls and saying that this is a matter of internal affairs, this is a law enforcement, it's not going to take that long, we're going to finish it in a few weeks, so do not touch us, do not tell us anything about how we're going to solve our own internal problems. So while this is happening, while the war was morphing into a full-blown civil war, not only inside in the country, but that involved the Eritrean forces in there. So all these calls went unanswered. So in the process now, what happened is that this is not a conflict between the TPLF and the federal government anymore. It started as such. Forces loyal to the TPLF were the ones that, for example, according to their own admission, took control of the Northern Command Post, when they were encircled prior to that attack on the North Command. So this was entirely a military issue between the TPLF-led government, armed people, and the federal government. Now this is no longer the case. Now the Tigrayan forces have renamed themselves. They're called Tigray Defense Force. And it involves opposition parties, almost everybody. This is a people's war against the central government. It has morphed into that. And the central government has failed to recognize the nature in which the war has evolved after that. We are seeing artists joining to defend the cause they believed in. We are seeing opposition group coming together with the TPLF. TPLF is in fact a word that's barely mentioned nowadays. They're calling themselves TDF, the Tigray Defense Force, and they have amalgamated forces there that were not even TPLF in the first place, even those forces that were against TPLF itself. So the war has changed its nature like that, while the federal government still maintains its fight is against the TPLF. So the failure to read the dynamics and how the war has changed, how it's being fought by the people of Tigray, not just by some armed groups belonging to the TPLF. This has hindered the government to accept any call for negotiation, because on top of that, the government has labeled the TPLF as a terrorist organization. So there is no possibility for the government to sit for a political negotiation with an organization they have tabled as a terrorist organization. This deprives the possibility of sitting for a political solution. And that is why I said in my article that there is no end in sight. And true to my argument in there, the war has been facing a renewed resistance the last 1 week. We are hearing several unconfirmed reports of heavy casualties, particularly on the Ethiopian Defense Forces side. This needs to be, of course, corroborated and verified, but there is no end in sight. In fact, it has crossed, and we didn't pay attention to it. The last few days, this war has been fought on the Amhara state land. In Sakota, there has been a military confrontation and conflict. That means it has seamlessly been exported to the Amhara state instead of being resolved. The international community, throughout this, what's happening is that they have dropped the term for political negotiation now. It has been slowly, gradually deplatformed. The call is now for ceasefire. There is no political negotiation attached to this ceasefire. And the call is now ceasefire for humanitarian corridor. So that's how you see the dynamics, and that the chance for political settlement of this conflict getting slim and slim by the day, while the international community keeps on dropping its demands dropping the demand for negotiated settlement out of this military conflict. So I do not see this and any end in sight for this, because no war has been won through fighting once it has started, and this is a war in every measure that we want to take to measure it. So that's why I say there is no end in sight.
So thank you, Tsedale, for that analysis and to help us understand the changing nature of the conflict from war between two parties to sort of a people's front against the central government, as you very rightly put. Now let's change tracks a little bit and talk about accountability. And my question here is to all three panelists. The government has announced that they plan to hold perpetrators accountable for atrocity crimes and have recently convicted 4 members of the armed forces of crimes against civilians, including rape and killings. And I mean, what Tsedale just now said, I mean, this question seems a little bit far-fetched, but I still want to hear your thoughts. Could there be a domestic avenue for accountability that is both plausible and impartial, or does the situation necessitate an international mechanism? And this question is particularly important in the context of the Human Rights Council. So, Fisseha, do you want to take the first crack, and then we go to Laetitia, and then after that, Tsedale, can you come in on the question?
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a very important question, and I would like to see it from the culture of accountability in Ethiopia, or the lack of accountability in Ethiopia for serious human rights violations. And it's not only in the Tigray conflict context, but it goes back to the last 30 years or more. These kind of human rights violations, at least serious human rights violations, were there in Ethiopia for a long time, in Oromia, in Somali region, but we have seen any meaningful act of remedy, including accountability in Ethiopia. So in the background of justice deficits, which has been piling up for years, it's improbable to expect that there will be accountability for crimes, for serious crimes. We are talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Tigray conflict. The Attorney General, the Federal Attorney General, has been saying that there is accountability by the which is under the military court against murder and rape, but I'm afraid that that does not amount to accountability to its full extent. Here we are talking about crimes that are international crimes, and the crimes committed are not necessarily ordinary murders or ordinary rape. They can constitute, if proven, they may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. So prosecuting individual perpetrators or actors does not cover the whole range of serious human rights violations, because, as I have already said, the mass executions, the GBV or the gender-based violence, the rape, the war crime, destruction of civilian targets, all these are not being covered in the trials the Attorney General is conducting. And the military courts, I mean, they are being under prosecution in military courts, according to the Attorney General. But these military courts are not accessible for the public, including the journalists, and for the media, and for the victims themselves. For that matter, we don't know if they are already taking place at all. Because before some weeks, the government said that those people who were killed in Aksum were combatants. And we, at Amnesty, we came back saying that the Attorney General is trying to cover up the violations of human rights by the Eritrean forces. And a week after our statement, they came up saying that we are prosecuting this amount of people. So what we see is that the government is trying to cover up the human rights violations that took place in the Tigray conflict.
Thank you for that. Laetitia.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add to what Fisseha has said and his initial point about a culture of impunity, which is obviously something we had raised again and again. I mean, obviously, when Prime Minister Abiy came to office, one of his big commitments was around accountability for past abuses. We did not see that materialize. But we are also talking about accountability for recent abuses. Now, just to, I mean, obviously this is outside of the context of Tigray, but tomorrow marks the 1-year anniversary of the killing of a very popular Oromo activist and singer. And we have documented a very disappointing response by the government, also once again, where it had committed to investigating both the killing of the singer himself, but also what was very serious intercommunal violence, which happened in the aftermath, but also a very abusive security force response, widespread arrests in many parts of Oromia. So we have again and again, under this administration, seen commitments to hold security forces and ordinary civilians to account for crimes which are less complex, and we haven't seen that materialize in justice. And I think here where we are talking about accountability for such serious abuses against many parts of the community. I mean, when coming to your question of civilians and civilians in Tigray, I think there are very few who have been left untouched by the violence and the war of the last few months. And so I think also making sure that there is a sense of credibility of the accountability mechanism and the redress that can happen is essential. And this is why we have, and we'll get to this point maybe later in the discussion, be calling from very early on, given our past research and given obviously what we've been finding in the last 8 months, called for an independent UN-led international investigation.
Thank you for that. Tsedale, do you want to come in?
There's really not much to say after the two experts on accountability and justice failure in Ethiopia's political context have said. But the one thing that I also what I would like to add is that even if the government is able to hold or stage a trial of those who are suspected, its credibility cannot be recognized by the victims because the government for the victims is a party to the conflict. And so there is a huge risk of even if it's happening. And as Fisseha said, we don't know if this is happening. The only time we know about it is from the statement from the Attorney General's office. The trials are not open for journalists. There is no journalist who have attended any of the trials. We have only learned about the conviction of the 4 officers through the statement from the Attorney General. So anything can happen beyond that. But even if it does happen, investigations take place, for what's happening in Tigray. There is the issue of credibility. Because the government is a party to this conflict. It's not a neutral party. And as we know, in Ethiopia, institutions are not separate. The Attorney General Office, one of the reform agenda that the Prime Minister has brought forward when he came was separation of power. That the judiciary will be independent and anything related to that, and from the executive and the legislature. What we see now is an Attorney General who's staunchly defending the Prime Minister, the political party, who also has become a member of that political party. So there's no departure from the past. So you would see that there is that mixture of an Attorney General being a party member, being investigating the party members that have allegedly orchestrated these atrocities. So there is that question of credibility, and that's why from the very beginning, in my testimony to the Congress back in December, I have recommended that there has to be not just independent, but a UN-led mandated investigation into what's happening, not just in Tigray, but throughout in Ethiopia. As Laetitia said now, the assassination last year of artist Hachalu Hundessa, which would be 1 year tomorrow, was one of the turning points that has turned the politics in Oromia regional state not only violent, but also a justified crackdown by the state. 1 year down the line, what we see is a public execution of dissidents. It has become, that the government violence has become the rule of law in Oromia regional state. There has not been any investigation of Hachalu Hundessa's assassination. There has not been even under the government's judiciary, under the Ethiopian judiciary even. The hearing is still happening. The crackdown, largely even by the report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, was absolutely horrendous. So there was no accountability established, and it's 1 year tomorrow. So that's why, and the UN Human Rights Office has actually offered its support to investigate the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa. So this is a government, a state, that has refused even to accept any collaboration in investigating one artist's killing that has a lot of ramification in the politics, that has led into several other killings after that. So it's about the credibility of it as well. It's not just the inability of the government or the inefficiency of this investigation. It is the credibility, even if they happen. So that's why it's absolutely essential that there is a UN mandated investigation, not only just in Tigray, but in many other. And that would probably be a good stepping stone to start correcting the wrongs that were going on in the last 3 years.
No, thank you for that. And I mean, and it's very clear that all three of you are calling for a UN mandated independent investigation, as there's a culture of impunity, lack of complete credibility. And I mean, a function of the UN mechanisms is not only about individual accountability, but it's also about establishing the truth of what has happened. And that is so important for both survivors and victims. So that's a really, really important point. So now my final question again to all three of you, and this is more about what can the Human Rights Council do. So as you know, Human Rights Council is currently convening its second regular session since the conflict started in November. So from your perspective, what could member states, and some of you have highlighted this, and what could member states, many of them who have joined us today, do in this session to confront the human rights emergency in Tigray and uphold the Council's mandate? And how should the Council consider the assertions by the Ethiopian government that any response issued prior to the conclusion of the OHCHR or the EHRC, OHCHR and EHRC investigation is too soon and counterproductive? So can we start with Laetitia, and then Fisseha, and then again Tsedale?
Sorry. Yes, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, I think the Human Rights Council has a very important role to play. It is somewhat shocking to us that Ethiopia is not currently on the agenda of the Human Rights Council. And that's why, given the magnitude, the gravity of what we're talking about, but the immediate prevention need, there is a level of urgency which, whether it is discussions at the Human Rights Council, whether it's discussions at the level of the Security Council, haven't really depicted. So I think it is absolutely key right now for the Human Rights Council to play its prevention role. It has a clear prevention mandate, but I think there's also a really important and an urgency here. So obviously it would be key to create a forum where in September, which obviously gives more time for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continue to gather information, but given the level of efforts to obscure information from coming out, it is absolutely key to create space for there to be much more transparency. Now, this is, of course, an opportunity for different stakeholders to have a discussion during an enhanced interactive dialogue in September, but it is absolutely key that the message is clear now that members of the Human Rights Council are aware of the gravity of the situation on the ground and are increasing scrutiny on the situation on the ground, because this is obviously, even though as we've described, it's often been difficult to continue to produce reporting in real time, but there is no doubt that these very serious abuses are continuing to date. And it's now time for the international community to step up.
Fisseha, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. In addition to this enhanced interactive dialogue in Ethiopia, which is key in terms of understanding the situation and the ongoing efforts of investigations in Tigray. The HRC has to also work with and has to create a synergy with the regional mechanisms like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And the African Commission has created a commission of investigation, which is a positive and welcome step. And so the Human Rights Council needs to coordinate and invite the Commission of Investigation and have to start consultation with them how to cooperate in this investigation. But one thing which we have to also, why we need these international and regional mechanisms is that some of the things we have said in the previous question about culture of impunity and lack of credibility, which Tsedale has put in clear terms. So the HRC has a very clear role in bringing this to the attention of the international mechanism, and they have to stay engaged with it. Thank you.
Tsedale?
Thank you. Again, being the last is, I would have to be a little bit creative enough. I would, I know, I would suggest for the council itself to start working with advocacy groups. There are so many advocacy groups that have a handy recommendation on how to address this gross human rights abuses in Ethiopia. I know of efforts that are being forwarded by United Tegaru Canada, for example. They have a resolution that they would like to table to the council. There are other advocacy groups such as the Oromo Lawyers Association or Oromo Advocacy Group who are directly dealing with the affected communities, or the Lemma advocacy group, the human rights, the Amnesty International has done an alarming study about minority atrocities against the Lemma minority being committed. That is in fact happening in the shadow of the war in Tigray. And there are also associations that are dealing with the Amhara, socioeconomic associations dealing with human rights abuses against the Amhara community. So there are these community advocacy groups that the council needs to really take seriously and recognize that their recommendations that they are forwarding to the council so that the voices can be specifically and tailor-made, be and easily addressed as well for the council. So this is the recommendation that I would forward, that they should be working with advocacy groups in order to reach to these communities that are being affected in Ethiopia.
No, that is an excellent point. I mean, I think that we always talk about, a level of advocacy which happens at the international level, and often the most important stakeholder, that is the affected population and stakeholders on the ground who are left behind. So That is an important point to be made, and we must encourage the Office of the High Commissioner to include those voices and to bring those voices to Geneva, to New York, to sort of light the fire under. So at this point, we don't really have a lot of member state speakers. I think they're all stumped by the excellent analysis that you have provided, and I hope that they have taken this in and are going to do something about the situation during the session. But we have some questions from the floor, but I have this one question here, which is, Ethiopia has become more entrenched in its refusal to come to a political settlement. The US and others have paused lending and restricted visas, but what other leverage does the international community have? Does anybody want to take a crack at this? Tsedale, I'm going to put you on the spot because you talked about this in your previous comment of how sort of the discussion has shifted from talking about a political solution to just ceasefire. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I do believe the international community has not deployed all the arsenals that it has so far in order to stop the war on Tigray. I think there has been some talks of an economic sanction, but I think that the dilemma again is how to implement those things without having the ordinary peoples to be at the receiving end of economic sanctions. So there is a lot of difficulties in that. The US's visa sanction is a good start. And I do believe there are still a lot of pressures to be applied against the Ethiopian government to accept a political settlement out of this. I think one among those can be, the stopping of the direct budget support, which is happening, but the government has not felt it yet. So that has to be stepped up, and there has to be other mechanisms devised. You know, in 2005, when in the post-election violence during the EPRDF regime, the international community has forcefully came forward to cut direct budget support to the government's coffin. And that was a punch where it hurt the most, right? Without affecting the most vulnerable. They have devised a means through the World Bank in which what they call the protection of basic services, which targeted the poor and the most vulnerable communities, targeted providing services to those highly affected and vulnerable communities. I think they can go into that kind of targeted economic sanctions if the government is not really willing to. It works on both ways. If parties to the conflict are not willing to lay down their arms, and if they want to thrive at the expense of civilians' life, there has to be a consequence for that. And Ethiopia, being a member of the international community, cannot really be let to slip through this very destructive war and disintegrate at the end. So there has to be, I think, a few more arsenal that the international community should deploy, short of direct intervention, of course. But if that's not also coming, there has to be also, a possibility of, for example, forcing the Eritrean forces, withdrawal of the Eritrean forces, a verified withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from Tigray, because I do not think that the Ethiopian government is able to do that at the moment. And they have not. It's been more than 3 months since Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed promised that there is an agreed withdrawal by the Eritrean forces, but they continue occupying and aggravating the conflict in Tigray. So if it comes to direct intervention to force the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from the sovereign land of Ethiopia, from where they are inflicting so much pain on the civilians there, so be it. But this is a lot more complicated, and there is no direct answer to that. So at the moment, what I see is a bit of a stepped up and targeted economic sanction in addition to the visa sanctions.
Those are great suggestions. Fisseha, do you want to comment on that?
Thanks, Savita. As Tsedale has said, economic sanctions might have a lot of repercussions for civilians and for development activities. So we don't usually endorse them because of their ripple effect on the vulnerable, especially for the people who are in poverty, because there are a number of projects which are supported by the international community. So, but there are other measures the international community can do, like some of them, like what the US has started movement restriction or arms embargo should be on the table. But yeah, but every measured activity should be taken, considering the effect it will have on the general population, especially the poor and the vulnerable.
Laetitia?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to what Tsedale and Fisseha have said, I mean, I think there are a range of tools which can be considered. The reality is, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are many voices which are missing. As we know, the African Union as a political entity has not in any shape or form responded in a way which would be required given the gravity, but also given that this conflict is happening on its doorstep. The international community, and here I also speak obviously of states in the Human Rights Council who have not pushed to see Ethiopia on the agenda during the previous session. And this is the opportunity, not only for maybe some of the states which have been much more proactive, which are unfortunately primarily Western states, but I think right now there is an international responsibility to end the atrocities and to prevent the atrocities from happening. And I think, you know, again, we obviously have seen Tigray and Ethiopia falling victim to broader dynamics, especially at the level of the Security Council. But there are actors who could definitely more proactively push for that to change. And that's also the UN at the highest level, at the Office of the Secretary General. There are a whole range of tools at his disposal at the moment to basically respond to just what we've seen in the last days, the killing of 3 workers from the medical charity MSF. I do think it is important to underline the gravity of this. This is not only an attack on humanitarian actors. MSF were one of the few forces actors on the ground who since the beginning have been trying to provide vital assistance. The magnitude of and the impact of this is really needs to be underlined. So, I mean, again, I think there are both tools, but there are also voices which are absent, which really need to start to speak up. And yes, of course, what we're calling for is a resolution so that there is a discussion in September, but we cannot wait till September for there to be concerted efforts at a whole range of levels to really make sure that this situation doesn't continue as it is, but could also get worse.
No, that is so important what all of you have emphasized. And Laetitia, your sort of call from the call to sort of ask the Secretary General to take a bolder stand on this issue is really, really important, because now we have reached a very critical point. I mean, we had reached a critical point in December, but I mean, it's still quite astounding that the lack of action on this situation. So now we have a speaker from one of the member states. I give the floor to the representative from Germany.
Hello, this is the representative from Germany. First of all, thank you very much for this vital discussion. Oh, sorry, turn myself muted. And my question relates to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. How do you rank its importance in the systematic progress that has to be made? Do you think it has a vital role in the next steps? And we would like to know that in order to better adjust our measures to be taken next.
Laetitia, can I give you the floor, and then Fisseha, and then the last word again from Tsedale, and then we plan to close the event.
Thank you very much. I mean, as we've been saying from the beginning, we continue to believe that a UN-led, independent, impartial investigation is absolutely key right now. Now, what we're calling for here is for the High Commissioner, who has, especially in the first few months of the conflict, was clearly putting out a number of statements based on what her office was gathering in terms of information. It was good to see that she has also released a statement again in the last few days, explicitly about the killings of the MSF workers. It is absolutely essential for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to continue to inform both the Council, but the global, broader international community about what is going on the ground. And that cannot just wait for the end of their joint investigations. There is a lot which the office needs to be doing now, and also an important role for them to continue to contribute to what is still difficult, a difficult context to really document what's going on the ground.
Fisseha?
Yes, that's a very important issue, actually, that we have to see the context in which this conflict is happening. This conflict is a result of a highly polarized and toxic political environment. And so the National Human Rights Commission body role should be seen in light of this highly polarized situation and the lack of credibility, the potential lack of credibility. And the HRC has been reformed recently. They have been providing a number of reports and investigation reports on situations not only in Tigray but other places. But there is a clear gap which needs to be filled there. So, yeah, that's what I can say right now.
Tsedale, the last word is on you.
Yeah, I'll just say it shortly. As Fisseha said, these atrocities are happening in the backdrop of a highly polarized political society. When I argued in my New York Times piece that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed promised peace, but he tore the country apart, this is exactly what I'm promising. The election that we just had last week happened to be the last thing that really tore us apart. Election being celebrated by a few members of the community, absolutely resented by the others who have been disenfranchised, who have not been, allowed to vote because of security problems. So the election, even an election, happens to be tearing us apart as a community. So the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission should be seen in light of this. Now, I'm not absolving the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission of some missteps that it did in the past, some even justification of the report that Amnesty International did in Oromia and in Command. Those things have really further polarized the Oromo community there, what the chief of the commission has said following that. So there are missteps by that. But it's also important to recognize that this is somehow now becoming an autonomous institution. As such, I think we should also pay attention that it might be not in the interest of the government officials themselves, the reports that it's releasing. Its report on Oromia, for example, a few months ago, was met by such a fury from the Oromia regional state government. They have absolutely dismissed the report that they have written. And so it has to be seen in light of that. More support and more demand must be there for the neutrality or eventual neutrality of the institution. We absolutely need that institution to continue the path that it started, but to double down on its autonomy, on its independence, and to show the Ethiopian people that it can really be trusted 100%. For that, it needs to be closely monitored by donors that are financing its development, its reform in there, and there has to be some mechanism of checks and balances to see how its relationship with the Ethiopian community, with all ethnic groups in the country, as diverse as we are, how is it handling those things? It has to be closely monitored and has to be encouraged to be more autonomous and more independent.
Thank you very much for that. And this was a really interesting and a rich discussion. I think that each of the panelists complemented each other in terms of not only talking about the current crisis and the current war that is taking place, but also the broader political context, not only for Tigray, but also for the country of Ethiopia. So I hope that this discussion can provide some impetus to the Council in terms of taking action as soon as possible. I mean, people of Tigray are relying on the international community to uphold its responsibility to protect. So with that, I would like to thank all our panelists and all the people who joined the discussion today and for your questions and for your interest. And thank you very much. You can find a recording of this event on the Global Center website and also through our Twitter and Facebook. Thank you very much. And the last word is that I would especially like to thank my colleague Sarah Hunter from the Global Center, our Ethiopia researcher who made this event possible with a lot of hard work and a lot of coordination. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing us all together for this very important discussion. Have a good day, and I'll